This podcast was made on the lands of the Wurundjeri people, the Woiwurrung and the Bunurong. We'd like to pay respects to their elders, past and present, and emerging. From the Melbourne School of Psychological Sciences at the University of Melbourne, this is PsychTalks.
Hi and welcome to PsychTalks. I'm Cassie Hayward, an Associate Professor here at the University of Melbourne School of Psychological Sciences. My specialisation is in applied psychology and behaviour change, and I'm joined by my co-host, social psychologist, Professor Nick Haslam. Hi, Nick.
Hi, Cassie. I'm looking forward to another great episode. And for anyone who's joining us for the first time, as always, we're going to be chatting with a psychology expert about their amazing research and hopefully giving you at home some insights and tips along the way.
That's right. And we have a fantastic topic today. We're exploring the complexities of the teenage brain. And to help guide us, we're joined by Dr Sarah Tashjian. Welcome, Sarah, to PsychTalks.
Thanks for having me.
Sarah, before we get into the details of the neuroscience of the teenage mind, can you tell us how you ended up in Melbourne?
Yeah, I have a bit of an untraditional story. I actually started my career as a corporate finance attorney. So I got a psychology and criminology bachelor's degree from the University of Florida. But I didn't really know what to do with it until my 30s. So I was a first-generation college student. I had never really met anyone who had a PhD or a career in research. But I've always been interested in why humans act the way they do, especially teenagers, who I think are really misunderstood. And that was definitely my personal experience as a teen, too. And as I learned more about brain development, and I was really fascinated by the fact that human biology can work both for us and against us, I realized that this was much more interesting than helping companies earn a lot of money. So I decided to leave the law, and I went and pursued a PhD. And then I completed a postdoc fellowship at Caltech in affective neuroscience. And then I was looking for a place to set up my lab and came here to the University of Melbourne. And Melbourne is a really great place to do this work because we have access to some really neat technology. So I use MRI scanning to look at the human brain and to look at how it functions when we do things like make decisions or experience our environment. And Melbourne has access to one of only 2 7 Tesla MRI scanners in Australia. And that's really incredible because 7 Tesla technology means we're scanning brains at almost double the strength of traditional research scanners. And it allows us to get much clearer and more detailed images of brain structures that I'm interested in. So little structures that are deep within the brain that have responsibility for emotion regulation and learning, but also structures that are sort of behind the forehead of the brain in the prefrontal cortex. And those are really prone to signal dropout and artifact and other kinds of technological issues with traditional scanners. So Melbourne offers me a great place to kind of look at those with real specificity.
So hopefully you've enjoyed other parts of being here in Melbourne as well. I think I heard on the grapevine that you're a bit of a coffee and sourdough fiend and that our food lives up to the standard of our scanners. As you said, we're going to be delving into the neuroscience aspect of things today. So just to start off, can you tell us a little bit about how much the brain really changes from childhood into the teenage years and then into adulthood? I keep hearing this word neuroplasticity. I'm not sure I really know what it means, but can you say how much the brain really does change?
Yeah, great question, Nick. And I will say the coffee and sourdough does live up to the hype. So that is definitely a draw. I think we should maybe just start by defining what we mean by neuroplasticity. So neuroplasticity is basically the brain's ability to change and adapt. And there's some really wonderful pioneering work by Linda Spear. She was a distinguished professor at Binghamton University in New York. She sadly passed in 2020, but her work is really pivotal to understanding the neuroplasticity of the teenage brain. So she's published a paper that's now been cited more than 5 5,000 times. And what her work and work from some other people in the field shows us is that the brain is really malleable, or it's capable of change during the teenage years. And we call it plastic because plastic is actually a malleable material, although I think that some people think of plastic as really rigid. So it's worth kind of clarifying that. Compared to the adult brain, the teenage brain experiences more rapid changes in connections between nerve cells, or what we call synapses. And during the time of adolescence, the brain forms new connections and it eliminates ones we don't need as much. And so this elimination is called synaptic pruning. And basically, it means that when we experience the world around us, we make stronger connections that help us interact with that world. And the connections that are no longer really useful for that, we get rid of them. And that way, our brain is more efficient. We're quicker when we make decisions and when we respond to things. All of that helps us to function better in adulthood. So during adolescence, there's an increase in synaptic pruning. There's also an increase in myelination, and that's the formation of a myelin sheath around nerve fibers in the brain. And what that does is help us move information around the brain faster. So basically, brain regions can communicate faster when there's more myelination. So we create these new synaptic connections. We get rid of old ones. We increase this myelination. And all of this makes our brain a little more specialized, which helps us to interact more efficiently with our environment. But it also does reduce our ability to change. So one of the things that makes the adolescent brain really special is that it's an open period for experiencing a lot of new things and for the brain to change a lot in response to those new things. And then as we become adults, we become maybe a bit more set in the way that our brain functions.
I love that you use that term synaptic pruning. I think it really conjures up that great imagery of what's actually going on in there. But I think what you've also talked about there highlights the importance of those teenage years. You know, when you say that what we give our teens in that time help shape their brain for the future. And we can come back to that concept later on when we chat about social media. But just going a bit deeper into this period of brain change in those teenage years, what major changes happen? And I guess more importantly for our listeners, what do those changes mean for teenage brains?
Yeah, that's a great question, Cassie. So in addition to those structural changes that I mentioned, there are also functional changes in the brain. And what this means is that the contributions from different parts of the brain during adolescence are maybe imbalanced. And we sometimes talk about this as a maturational imbalance. So what that means is that subcortical regions of the brain, or those regions that are deep in the middle of the brain, those mature early by around age 14 to 16. And these regions are responsible, like I mentioned before, for things like emotion processing and sensory processing. And we talk about this subcortical development. We're often thinking of regions like the amygdala and the striatum. People are kind of familiar with those terms. These are parts of the socio-emotional system, and they're responsible for processing emotions and seeking out rewards. So most of our behavior is really driven by wanting rewards in our environment, but we also have emotional motivations that are really important. So we motivate ourselves to learn new skills and tackle challenges and engage with the world around us, all during this period of adolescence, because this part of the brain is already mature and sort of fully functioning. But while these regions are already contributing a lot to our behavior, the prefrontal cortex is not fully mature. So that's the part of the brain that's right behind the forehead, and it doesn't really mature until the mid-20s. And this is important because the prefrontal cortex is essentially our control center in the brain, and it helps us to make thoughtful, slow, considered decisions, to grapple with the pros and cons of things when we're weighing how we should respond to things in our environment. So in humans, this region is really highly developed. It's responsible for a lot of complex functions, things we call executive functions. And the developmental timing of these regions, or this maturational imbalance between the subcortical system and that prefrontal system, is responsible for a lot of what we consider unique about the teenage period.
Sarah, my kids are not yet teenagers and Nick's kids are past that age. But for our listeners who have teenagers, I think they might describe this time more colourfully than a maturational imbalance. Is some of that typical teenage behaviour that we hear about and see a result of those differences in maturation of those brain areas? So does not having a developed prefrontal cortex explain some of that poor decision-making that's really stereotypical of those teenage years?
Absolutely. So this model of imbalanced brain development has been used to explain a lot of different behaviors that we consider typical of adolescence, in particular risk-taking and impulse control. So first, we kind of think about reward sensitivity as following an inverted U shape or a frowny face kind of shape, meaning that it peaks around adolescence. So in contrast, impulse control increases gradually and linearly. So if you think about these two shapes interacting with each other, we kind of have this big gap where one is really high and the other is still growing. And together, this means that reward sensitivity is high, but impulse control is relatively low. And this increases risk-taking during adolescence, meaning that teenagers are more likely than adults to make risky decisions.
Sarah, another area of behaviour that seems emblematic of that teenage period is also imbalance of emotions. Are the brain systems involved in emotions also impacted by these imbalances in maturation?
Definitely. The subcortical regions I mentioned, particularly the amygdala and the striatum, they contribute to emotion processing. So the amygdala is really key in processing emotions like fear and pleasure, as well as response to uncertainty. And it helps us to respond to threats in our environment, but also to remember emotional experiences so that we can remember what was good and what was bad so that we can motivate our behavior to get those rewards. The striatum is often associated with the brain's reward system, but it also plays a crucial role in learning, as well as motivation and feelings of pleasure. And these regions are both regulated by the prefrontal cortex, but during adolescence, because of that maturational lag, they kind of have an outsized influence on behavior and decision-making because of the delay in that prefrontal cortex regulation.
And does that lag in development, so those late changes to the prefrontal cortex, does that help explain some of those behaviours that we kind of think of around risky teenage behaviour like unsafe driving or other unsafe behaviours?
You're absolutely right, Cassie. And unsafe driving is a really interesting example. There was a pivotal study in 2011 by Jason Chine and Larry Steinberg at Temple University, and it influenced actually a lot of reform on driving regulations. So they used this really cool task called the stoplight task. It's been used by myself and others since then. And in this task, participants are in the MRI scanner. They play this computerized driving game. And during the game, they reach several intersections with stoplights. Some of these stoplights are yellow, so the participant can choose to go or stop. And if they choose to stop, they get a small time delay. But if they choose to go, they might make it and reach the end of the course sooner and get a bigger reward. However, they might also crash, right? And so this is a really good example of real-world implications. And basically what they found is that for teenagers, they actually made fewer risky decisions than adults, but only when they played the game alone. So when they played the game while they were being watched by another teenager, which might happen if you're driving in the car with your friends, for example, they made more risky decisions and they also crashed more frequently. And so what this showed was that the reward-sensitive regions of the brain were overactive during the sessions where they were being watched by other teenagers. And that contributed to their risk-taking by running those yellow lights. And this work really contributed to a lot of regulatory change in the U.S. and elsewhere with graduated driving laws. So teenagers can't drive with their friends in the car until they've been driving for a year or they're around age 18, because we know that these sort of heightened reward sensitivity regions are going to change their decision making.
Such a great story of a translational impact of basic neuroscience research.
It's one of my favorites.
And it's so fascinating, I think, also that the impact of an observer is more on the reward sensitivity rather than diminishing the self-control capacity. So you mentioned inhibition there, and I think that's one of those words that might get confused a little bit. Can you clarify what we mean when we use inhibition in this context?
Yeah, definitely. Inhibition in the context of teens and the prefrontal cortex refers to the ability to suppress or control impulsive behaviors and responses. So I'll kind of unpack that a little bit. Impulsive behaviors are those that we might do without careful thought or consideration of the potential consequences. So they're sort of rapid actions. These behaviors are often driven by our immediate desires or our urges or our emotions, which we talked about earlier. And impulsive actions can include making quick decisions, acting on emotional states, or taking risks without thinking about the consequences. And the prefrontal cortex really helps teenagers inhibit these impulsive actions by increasing their ability to evaluate the consequences of their actions. They can also better resist temptations, and they can make more thoughtful decisions instead of acting on immediate urges. So without that inhibitory control, they might be more likely to respond to that reward motivation to impress their friends or to get that extra money at the end of the course.
I think with that definition, our listeners can easily see the bad side of reduced inhibition in teenagers. So it might be risky behaviour around substance abuse or unsafe sex or the reckless driving that we've talked about, or even inability to study because of not being able to see those long-term goals or rewards. But is that reduced inhibition always a bad thing, or can it actually be adaptive for teens?
Yeah, reduced inhibition isn't necessarily bad. So your intuition is right there. It can also be adaptive for many of the key tasks of adolescence. So when I talked before about the structural and functional changes of the brain, I think what I want to underscore there is that this means that teenagers are receptive to both positive and negative influences. This plasticity means they're just really open in general. So this means that reduced inhibition can facilitate positive things like exploration, which can lead to acquiring new skills or knowledge, and increasing social connections outside of the family unit. And this exploration is really essential for adolescent development. It helps teens learn about themselves, form their own identity, and interact with the world around them to establish independence from their parents. In some individuals, as you mentioned, it may lead to maladaptive behavior like drug use or unprotected sex. But in others, it might lead to more considered attempts to win the admiration of others. And so that can manifest not just as risk-taking, but things like doing well in school, trying to earn money. So rewards come in many forms. And basically, reduced inhibition helps us seek out rewards in our environment, which is an important motivator, and it can be both good and bad.
Really good to hear that kind of balanced appraisal when you don't always. It's mostly, I think, in the context of danger and risk and bad things. So you've said that there are these important good and bad sides to a lack of inhibition, and we just have to help our teens get through these times. Is there anything to keep in mind in terms of making it easier or just dealing with the reality of these necessary neurological changes?
Definitely. I agree that we need to help teens sort of harness the power of their brain changes during this time. One of the things we haven't talked about yet that also changes during adolescence is sleep. And it may seem like this isn't directly related to impulse control or things we've been talking about, but during my PhD, I did a lot of work on adolescent sleep and brain development. And what that work showed is that sleep interferes with neural systems that are really important for inhibition during adolescence. So adolescents who get worse sleep are also more prone to these risky decision-making problems that we might see during this time. To put this in more context, there are a lot of changes in sleep that occur during puberty. So Mary Carskadden is really a wonderful researcher who wrote a great paper on teen sleep called Sleep in Adolescence, The Perfect Storm. It's such a beautiful title. And what she showed is that during adolescence, there's a shift in circadian rhythms, which leads to a preference for staying up later at night and sleeping in later in the morning. So anybody who's a parent of a teen will have observed this. It is natural and biologically driven. So give your teens a little bit of a break. But this is due to changes in the production of melatonin, which is a hormone that regulates sleep and tends to be released later in the evening for teens. So there's this kind of sleep phase delay. And then there's also an increase in sleep need, where teenagers actually need more sleep than they do when they're younger, but they get less sleep because they're more involved with school and socializing, and they have other pressures outside of their sleep schedule. So adolescents tend to have less sleep than they need. They have this sleep phase delay. And then they also experience more variability in their sleep. So they have these inconsistent bed and wake times. During the week, they might have to wake up really early to go to school. And then in the weekends, they sleep in much later, trying to make up for that sleep debt. But that can actually be problematic. So someone I worked with at UCLA, Andrew Fellini, has a great study that shows that sleep variability is actually potentially more important to health than sleeping longer. Eva Telzer, who's now at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, she did a longitudinal study with Andrew during her PhD, and what they saw was that greater sleep variability 1 year prior to an MRI scan was associated with lower white matter integrity over and above the effects of sleep duration. So white matter is involved in that myelination process that we were talking about. And what this shows is that when teens are having problematic sleep, either because they're not getting enough or because they're having this heightened variability, we see these long-term impairments in the developing brain. And this affects their socio-emotional judgments, their decision-making, their ability to learn. The architecture of sleep that's achieved during the night also changes during adolescence. So you're kind of picking up on a theme. It's basically everything involved with sleep changes during the teenage years. But what this means is that they might experience a decreased amount of deep sleep during the night, and that can affect sleep quality and make them more sleepy during the day, which means they have a hard time paying attention in school, things like that. My work shows that poor sleep quality has a greater impact on affect-related impulsivity. So what we've been talking about so far, making decisions really quickly when you have an emotional motivator. And so similar to the stoplight study I mentioned before, in emotional or social contexts, teens with poor sleep quality are more susceptible to being impulsive, particularly if they are struggling with their sleep or their emotional regulation. Lack of sleep can also heighten emotional responses and reduce the ability to manage stress. So those are things that we often think about in the adolescent period, and it makes adolescents more prone to rash decisions and less capable of considering the long-term consequences of their actions. So there are really a lot of ways that poor sleep during adolescence can exacerbate these other features of brain development and behavior during this time. And that's something that's actually maybe easier to change than we might think.
Moving on from this idea of poor sleep, one thing that might impact poor sleep is screens before bedtime. And I don't think we can have a discussion about teen inhibition and decision-making without talking about social media, whether it's social media per se or just the screens that are interacting with their sleep. But there's a big push at the moment to increase the age of social media access to 16. Taking this in context of the sleep stuff you've mentioned, but also the reward mechanisms of the teenage brain, all of that. What are your thoughts about this kind of push to increase the age of social media? Is it protective to keep them away, or is it a bit of a kind of panic about the age? What would you say to that push that's going on at the moment?
Yeah, it's certainly a hot debate. And I'm a bit hesitant to wade too far into it. It's a little bit outside of my area of expertise. And we really do need quite a bit more research on the impact of social media. But my general response is that outright bans usually aren't effective, particularly for teens who might be even more encouraged to circumvent those restrictions. But that doesn't mean that keeping cell phones or social media outside of schools is necessarily ill-advised. We restrict a lot of activities in school, but I want to discuss it a bit more in terms of the science. So the current evidence doesn't really appear to support a strong causal association between digital technology use and mental health problems. There aren't a lot of studies that show that effect over time. But the panic that parents and the media are currently experiencing about the idea of social media causing a mental health crisis, I think even though that may not be supported by the science, it's worth discussing because we do see an increase in mental health problems during the adolescent period. So during the teenage years, we see an increase in the prevalence and onset of depression and anxiety, as well as other mental health issues. And these are driven by a lot of complex genetic and environmental factors, including things like poverty and social violence. These all play a role. And one way that social media might exacerbate that is by this sort of 24-hour news cycle or exposure to a lot of information about these potentially distressing environmental factors that are weighing in here. Now, having said that, there is evidence that access to phones, as you alluded to, could be problematic in certain contexts. So, for example, my work does show that the more teens use their phones at night, the worse their sleep is. So that is an important tidbit worth considering, given everything we just talked about with respect to how much sleep is changing and how important it is for adolescent brain functioning. But I want to make the sort of counter argument that I think is a little bit less popular, perhaps. There are a lot of reasons why access to social media might be beneficial for teens. So the teen years are defined not just by this risk-taking and this impulsivity and this emotional expression, but also by a deep need to socialize and to expand our social networks. And a major benefit of social media is social connection. So teens are able to connect with friends that they already have, but they might live far away or not see them. They can also make new connections, and they might have an easier time finding people who share identities and interests with them on social media. Teens also struggle with social anxiety that onsets during the adolescent years. So practicing conversations over social media might be a way to gain some confidence for those face-to-face interactions. And for teens who have marginalized identities, social media can help them access and stay in touch with support networks. So social media provides teens with an opportunity to really engage with other people, but also with issues that they might care about or engaging with current events. The teenage years are an important time for activism. One of the things that seeking out of reward does is encourages teens to potentially take up social causes that they think are really important to them. And that's a great outlet for teenagers. So a better way to explore the association between social media and adolescent well-being might be to ask how teens are using social media. Are they scrolling potentially harmful content about body image? Are they engaging in bullying? Or are they engaging with friends directly? Are they posting things that they and their parents have deemed to be age appropriate? Are they gaining access to news or new information for developing skills? You and I were talking earlier about how your kids really like to learn about new soccer tricks on social media, right? I use it for new yoga poses. So it can be a helpful way to kind of expand one's identity, connect with others, and to learn new skills. So my suggestion would be to try to help teens mitigate the harm that social media might bring into their life. Get parents and teens in coalition to discuss how and when they use social media, what they think are the benefits and the drawbacks, what can they themselves see about when it feels good and when it doesn't feel good. And instead of taking away their access to social media, which is punitive and potentially patronizing and also isolating, making them feel like you don't understand their experience, we can encourage them to spend time on other activities they might find valuable, like physical movement, art and creative expression, in-person time with friends, or taking what they learn on social media in those other avenues. So if parents are interested in some more concrete recommendations, I'd suggest them looking at the American Psychological Association's health advisory on social media use in adolescence. It makes recommendations about social media use based on the scientific evidence that we have to date. And it can help teens develop a healthy relationship with social media by encouraging digital literacy, which I think is really important during this age.
And we can put that link in the show notes. And I like your advice about parents being more involved with how their kids are using the internet or social media or YouTube or whatever, rather than just saying you can't use it anymore. Getting them to work together with their teens to find a way that kind of works for them, and making sure they're not getting into the murky, dark territory, but using it for good.
Yeah, social media is not going anywhere, really. So we need to help teens figure out, what's the most beneficial way to integrate it into their lives.
So that's really helpful advice on the social media issue. Can you give us other things parents could do, Sarah, to help their teens through these potentially tumultuous years?
Absolutely. One thing beyond having these more open and direct discussions with teens, which is always beneficial no matter what the topic is to consider how to improve teen sleep. So as I sort of alluded to earlier, it has an impact on a lot of functioning during the adolescent years. And my work shows that the more parents monitor their teens' bedtime, the more teens sleep. So it may seem that we want to take a hands-off approach to asking our teens what time they go to bed or to implementing structure around that, but actually parent intervention really does help. We also find that teens who reported having more comfortable pillows have better sleep quality. So that may seem kind of surprising, but it's a really low-cost way of impacting sleep quality. It certainly won't hurt, and it might actually help teens harness the neural resources they have to make good decisions and to take full advantage of this window of plasticity to help them learn and grow. So ask them about their pillows and ask them what time they go to bed and see if it helps.
And on the risk-taking side of things, it is something that parents worry about. Mine aren't teens yet, but I still worry about risk-taking with 3 boys. But as you've said, that exploration and pushing of boundaries is important for teens to grow. So what are some things that parents can think about on the risk-taking side of things?
Parents really need to know that it's normal for teens to take risks, but it's also an essential part of their healthy development. So they should be careful not to discourage risk-taking. Of course, parents are going to worry about their teens, but really, instead of preventing them from doing something potentially risky, it would be more beneficial to help them make a plan of what they're going to do in risky situations before they're in those heightened emotional contexts. So before they're around their friends or before they're having those emotional responses. Those emotional responses overpower their impulse control. But when you're sitting at home in a kind of calm discussion, they can engage those prefrontal cortex regions and think about decision making. So an example would be talk about different potential scenarios and let your teen reason through the ways they might respond. What happens if they show up to a party and there's alcohol present? What will they do? How will they say no to peer pressure? Or if they find themselves in a situation where they've done something dangerous, have the conversation about how they can reach out for help before things get worse. And making these plans before they're in the moment and it's harder to inhibit those risky behaviors will really set up teens for having autonomy, which we know is really important during this period, but without those major negative consequences that parents are worried about.
Such great advice. We've covered so much today and there's so many interesting pieces to digest, but thank you so much for talking to us about your work, Sarah. And can I knock on your office door in a few years when my kids reach this age?
Absolutely. And I might knock on yours to have them come get their brain scanned too.
They would love it.
You've been listening to PsychTalks with me, Nick Haslam and Cassie Hayward. We'd like to thank our guest for today, Dr Sarah Tashjian. This episode was produced by Carly Godden with production assistance from Mairead Murray and Gemma Papprell. Our sound engineer was Jack Palmer. Thanks for tuning in to this new series of PsychTalks. Bye for now.